So let's go ahead and begin. At this time, let's do our attendance check-in if you don't mind. Please type present for your attendance in chat. If you did not sign in with your full name, be sure to include it in the message. Outstanding. Okay, we just completed our last unit number 4, yesterday evening. Actually, I want to go real quickly. Test number 4, a few items for clarification. The average test grade during this last session was 89% or B+. Standard deviation of 2.24 points. The average time for taking the test was 40 minutes and 33 seconds, and there were a population of 17 test takers. Okay, so the grade did go down a little bit, not greatly, but it did go down a tad from our last opportunities here. Let's go over some of the items. Again, the items for clarification are items that more than 30% of you missed. Okay, so items for clarification, we start off with feeling accountable. Feeling accountable for a group project would not, I repeat, would not lead to social loafing. In fact, that's one of the things that sort of would suggest that you would tend to loaf. You don't feel accountable for the group project, therefore you're more likely to cut out, not participate in things of that nature. Then the other item we wanted to clarify a little bit was prejudice. Prejudice is a mixture of generalized beliefs, negative emotions, and predispositions to act or to behave in certain ways. And then self-discipline. Self-discipline is a key component of achievement motivation. In fact, one of the key things that we see oftentimes for people who are successful in college is not necessarily their intelligence scores, but their degree of self-discipline, their motivation. And then finally, married people tend to report being very happy more than separated and divorced people. So we see the idea of being connected with someone in marriage does seem to have some impact on our perceptions of happiness. Okay, so that was our last unit. So good job on that. We did see a little bit of a dip, but we're still doing quite well with our exams there. All right, so today we begin unit number 5, which is going to be made up of the chapter 13 on personality and chapter 14 on psychological disorders. Okay, so we start off by looking at an overview of personality. So the ways of looking at the self. We're going to look at Freudian psychodynamic views, the unconscious parts of the self. We'll look at the humanistic views of self-actualizing person. We'll examine traits, including the big 5 factors of dimensions. We'll look at social and cognitive influences on personality, and self-esteem and the self-serving bias. For the last 3 items, we'll probably look at that in our next class session. So these different perspectives and concepts can help us examine what we have in common based on personality, components of personality, basic drives, stages of development, categories of traits, and ways in which we differ, the individual paths that we take through certain stages, the ways of managing our basic drives and needs, and the levels of trait dimensions that we actually do possess. So personality is going to be a key item that we'll be discussing. And as I discussed it last session, personality is going to be that consistent way that we think, feel, and behave across a variety of situations. We cannot talk about personality without first talking about Freud. Freud was a key and instrumental figure to psychology in general, but also to our understanding of personality, or the initial ideas of personality. So let's look at the psychodynamic theories of personality, bringing out the unconscious part of your personality. That's how you can really look at it. So we'll look at Freud on the psychoanalytic on such things as the personality structure, the id, ego, and superego. Personality development, his very controversial psychosexual stages of development. We'll look at defense mechanisms. The neo-Freudian or psychodynamic theorists from sexual to social issues, how the neo-Freudians, the Freudians after Freud taught many of these individuals. And so after he had an influence on them, they changed some of their perspectives on psychodynamic issues and how we do assess unconscious processes using projective tests. And then we'll look at modern ideas about the unconscious and other Freudian concepts. So let's talk about personality. A personality is an individual's characteristic patterns of thoughts, feelings, and behaviors, and it persists over time and across situations. So this is something that is very important to us, okay, when it comes to how we may identify ourselves and how you may identify your friends. Now, who are these characters that we see on the screen? Can anybody tell me or type in chat who these guys are?
It's the 7 dwarfs from Snow White.
Thank you very much. The 7 dwarfs from Snow White. Now, we've changed the names a little bit here to introverted, agreeable, open, naive, contentedly lethargic, conscientious, neurotically irritable, and sensitive reactive. But the idea is that you can sort of describe these characters by personality traits. I wanted to just show you what these sort of look like. Now, going back to what their original names are, Sneezy, Sleepy, Happy, Doc, Grumpy, Dopey, Doc, and Bashful, the idea here is that we can look at certain types of traits that we've seen before. We've seen this, if we remember Canoe from previous chapters, and we'll revisit this a little bit later on our next session, but we have openness to experience, conscientiousness, extroversion, agreeableness, neuroticism. You may remember some of those ideas and terms. The notion is that we can describe people on these traits. We have certain characteristics of how they behave. If you think about your best friend, how open to experience is your closest friend? How extroverted is your brother, your sister, or your nearest relative? All of these are describing the patterns of thoughts, feelings, and behaviors about these individuals and how they may persist over time. Especially if you've known somebody for a few years, you say they were this way when they were a kid, they're that way as a teenager, and also as a young adult, because these things do tend to persist over time and across situations. So let's get back into Freud. So we want to start off by looking at Freud because he was very key to establishing this idea of personality, looking at his psychodynamic and psychoanalytic theories here. These theories of human personality focus on the inner forces that interact to make us who we are. All right. So to help you understand, these things focus on bringing out our unconscious thoughts, our feelings and conflicts, and those even rooted all the way back in childhood. So these theories are looking at inner forces that interact to make us who we are. In this view, behavior as well as human emotions and personality develop in a dynamic, and that means interacting and changing interplay between conscious and unconscious processes, including various motives and inner conflicts. So we have established when we were rather young, things that go on, things that have an influence on us. And the key thing is we may not always know what those influences are. That's one of the big insights that Freud had, is that some of this stuff can be unconscious and we're not really aware of them. So Freud's path to developing psychoanalysis. So Sigmund Freud started out his career as a physician. In fact, he was trained as a physician. He didn't stay being a physician because of him being Jewish. There was a lot of anti-Semitism in the area where he was trying to practice his craft, and therefore he wound up doing something slightly different. So he started out his career as a physician, but he decided to explore how mental and physical symptoms could be caused by purely psychological factors. Now, he saw patients with very unusual symptoms, such as recurring blindness or paralysis only of the hand. They did not seem to have any physical causes whatsoever. So he sought to understand how the different parts of human personality interacted, including the hidden unconscious parts. So he became aware that many powerful mental processes operate in the unconscious. That's, again, without our awareness. We don't know what's going on. So we may have some sort of symptomology of something that may be causing us physical issues, but we don't know why that's going on. So that's what his insight brought to him. So this insight grew into a theory of the structure of human personality and how it developed. His name for this theory that he came up with and his therapeutic technique was psychoanalysis. Now, psychoanalysis. How did Freud use psychoanalysis to bring unconscious processes of patients into conscious awareness, especially an embarrassing process such as the shame about touching one's genitals, leading to hand paralysis, for example? So here is what he did. Techniques for revealing the unconscious mind. He used creative techniques such as free association, where you would have someone encourage the patient to speak whatever comes to mind, whatever they need to pops in, they need to blurt it out. And by doing that, the therapist then interprets any potential unconscious wishes hidden in the client's hesitations, slips of the tongue, and or dreams when they share dreams. So the idea is that if you go through the day, sometimes you may say something that you did not really want to say. Let's look at the cartoon to the right here. We have the queen apparently walking into the throne room, and the king is already sitting down on his throne. And the king says to his wife, "Good morning, beheaded. I mean, beloved." So that would be considered a Freudian slip. What that implies is that he may have some unconscious wishes to do what? Get rid of his wife, okay? So that he may move on to another wife or whatever the case may be. But that's what it's meant, that sometimes things are hidden from us and they may slip out. And it's the therapist's job to try to uncover these hidden things by the behavior of the therapist. So now let's get to Freud's structure of personality. Now, obviously, from the definition that we've had about the personality a few sessions ago, as the one that we mentioned today, personality is very instrumental to who we are. And basically, some would say we are our personality to some extent. The way we think, feel, behave, there's really not much left of us, is there? So when it comes to personality, Freud's personality, we've probably seen this somewhere before. Many of you probably have. And this is the mind as an iceberg. And this, I believe, was borrowed, I think, from Fechner, this idea of the iceberg. So in this view, Freud sees personality, or the mind, is mostly below the surface of conscious awareness. And we can see that the waterline is up here, and most of this iceberg is underneath the waterline. Only a small portion of it is above. So the mind is mostly below the surface of conscious awareness. Personality develops from the efforts of our ego, which is mostly conscious. It makes peace between the id and the superego here. It is our rational self to resolve tension between our id, located down here under the waterline, and the unconscious energy based on biological drives, okay? And the superego, located here, also mostly underneath the unconscious here. And this is the society's rules and constraints. So what he's saying is that we have a certain degree of access to these major personality driving factors, the ego primarily, a little bit of the superego, but that id is really underneath the waterline. And it's, for the most part, something that we sort of keep hidden to some extent. So the unconscious, in Freud's view, is a reservoir of thoughts, wishes, feelings, and memories that are hidden from awareness because they feel unacceptable. Okay, and that's the key thing. Things which in our life, even early in our life, are deemed to be unacceptable, inappropriate, shameful, we push them down and they may reside in the unconscious, where those things are going to be hidden from us. Therefore, getting back to psychoanalysis that Freud is developing, his job is to try to get at all of those things hidden from the client, from the patient, hidden from their conscious inspection, because they're part of the unconscious world, part of their thoughts, wishes, and feelings they want to remain hidden and unaware of because they are unacceptable. So this is how he structures our personality. We have these items of ego, superego, and id, and we have part that is conscious and part that is unconscious. Any questions or comments so far before we move on? And I'm sure most of you have probably seen this depicted in one way or another before. Okay, so how does this develop? So the developing personality follows the following process, according to Freud. We start life with a personality made up of the id, striving impulsively to meet basic needs, living by the pleasure principle. If it's good for us, if it's fun for us, we do it. We do it only because we're living in the id at that moment. Okay, so that's how we are born. We're born with our id already in operation. Then, in a toddler, an ego develops, a self that has thoughts, judgments, and memories following a reality principle. So when we're really young, it's all about the id. There's no ego involved. We have no real sense of self yet. Okay, and you may remember, if you've had to take care of kids or been around kids when they're really, really young, they don't seem to have any idea of pride or embarrassment. They do whatever feels good and is natural to them. A little bit later, as they develop an ego, they'll start to develop this sense of shame and pride. When you have the shame and pride, that implies that you have a self, and they understand that they indeed have a self. So again, in a toddler, an ego develops a self that has thoughts, judgments, and memories, and it follows this reality principle. Then around age 4 or 5, the child develops the superego, a conscience internalized from parents and society, followed a morality principle. So by the time they're 4 or 5, what Freud proposes here is that they start to understand right from wrong based on their parents or their caretakers, whoever's taking care of them. They would have started to punish for right behavior, reward for right behavior, punish bad behavior, and so on. They get an idea of what is right and what is wrong. Here, when they start to do that, they began to internalize these principles of right and wrongness into their own mind. Now, I had a nephew, this was decades ago when he was really, really young. And one time he would get caught doing something, and the parents or the adults would show up, and he'd be caught with a, like the deer in the headlight look. And then all of a sudden he'd hold his left hand out, and then he'd use his right hand to punish himself, to go ahead and give him his spanking, so to speak. So by that time, obviously, he's around that age that he understands right and wrong, at least how right and wrong has been communicated by his parents. Okay, and he's began to internalize that idea. And that's the beginning of the morality principle, the idea of what is right and what is wrong. Now, the ego has a very important job. Okay, the ego works as an executive of this three-part system of the id, ego, and superego. Okay, his job, the ego's job, is to manage bodily needs and wishes in a socially acceptable way. Remember, the id is all about the body's needs and wishes and desires. Okay, and if the id had its say, it would do it whatever it wanted to, no matter who else was around. But by the time you're old enough, the ego has already internalized some of the morality principles about conscious the conscience of good and right. And so it will try to manage those bodily needs in ways which are socially acceptable. So, Freud, how do we develop? Freud's theory of psychosexual stages is somewhat controversial, and you'll see why in a moment. But the basic idea is the following. The id is focused on the needs of the erogenous zones, and Freud coined this term, the erogenous zones. I'm sure you may have heard of it before. The id is focused on the needs of the erogenous zones, and these are sensitive areas of the body where we usually derive pleasure from it, okay? Let me go back here. And you can see here in the cartoon, they flipped the cartoons, so I want to make sure we went over them. So you have apparently, it looks like a married couple in a library or study in their home. And it says, oh, for goodness sake, the wife says, smoke. Okay, as opposed to smoking, what is the husband doing there? Can you guys see? Anyone?
Yeah, I think he's smoking, or I'm sorry, I think he's sucking his thumb.
He's sucking his thumb. So basically, this points to a fact that one of the zones that we have early on, as we'll see when we get to the psychosexual stages, is the oral phase. And so this cartoon is being somewhat humorous because the wife is saying, oh, for goodness sake, smoke. She's telling him to go ahead and smoke a cigarette or a cigar, as opposed to reversing back his age and sucking his thumb. Okay, now again, that would indicate an oral fixation. And oral fixations, we'll see a little bit, is when you have not fully gotten out of a stage, you're sort of stuck at a particular stage, and you tend to overdo things that would have gave you pleasure at that particular stage. This is one of the reasons why some people would say, people who always have to have something in their mouth, like a toothpick or straw, and they're always chewing or chewing bubble gum or gum, they may have somewhat of an oral fixation. So people feel shame about these needs and can get fixated at one stage, never resolve how to manage the needs of that zone. Here you can see two young kids, probably around the ages of 3 to 6 or so. It looks like they might be in a sandbox. It reads, I heard that as soon as we become aware of sexual impulses, whatever they are, we'll have to hide them. So here we see this idea of shame. So they're old enough at least to have this notion of shame and having to hide things. So fixated is what occurs when you don't fully or effectively get out or manage a particular stage of development, according to Freud. So here are the stages of development. I'm going to pause real quickly to take a drink. All right, I'm back. So here are the stages that Freud laid out. We have the oral stage around birth to around 18 months. And the focus here, pleasure or the erogenous zone, centers on the mouth. So at this age, we see a lot of sucking, biting, and chewing. Then we have the anal stage, which is around 18 months to 36 months. Here we include the terrible twos you may have heard of before. The pleasure focuses on bowel and bladder elimination. It's one of the key things that we see during this stage, where you try to toilet or potty train the young one. And so coping with demands of control is what we see here during this particular stage. Then we have the phallic stage. This is around ages 3 to 6 years old. Here, the pleasure zone is the genitals, coping with incestuous, I did say that, incestuous sexual feelings. We'll see more about that in the next slide. So it's this phallic stage where we have the most of the controversy, according to Freud's psychosexual stages of development. Then from 6 all the way on to puberty, we have the latency stage. Here is a phase of dormant sexual feelings. And then after puberty on, we have the genital stage, where we have maturation of sexual interest. Now, obviously, from all of this, from the name and title of his theory of stages of our development, one key thing that Freud seems to be interested in when he developed his theory and his approach to this was sex. And that's where we do see a lot of this interest lies in this type of behavior. So let's move on to dive in a little bit into what these stages mean. So for the most part, we go through the oral and anal stage, but then we get to the phallic stage, we do see some particular issues. We have male development issues. Freud believed that as boys in the phallic stage, they seek genital stimulation. They begin to develop unconscious sexual desires for their mothers and hate their father as a rival, feeling guilt and fearing punishment by castration. There's a lot in that statement. There's a lot in that statement. First, it's not the same type of sex as an adult that we would normally think of sexual desires, but it does refer to sex. So basically, we have a young boy who wants mother to possess mother and sees father as the rival or the enemy. But the father is stronger and more powerful than he is, and therefore he has fear, and he fears punishment. And this way, we see punishment by castration. All right, so that's the male development issue there. Now, he named these feelings the Oedipus complex after a story from Greek mythology. And let me give you a little bit of rundown on that story real quickly. It's a tragic hero in Greek mythology, Oedipus, who accidentally fulfilled a prophecy that he would end up killing his father and marrying his mother, thereby bringing disaster to his city and family. And so, as most tales of the Greek mythology, a very twisted tale and a very sad one to an extent. So that's where the name the Oedipus complex comes from this Greek tale. So obviously we see the situation evolve based on this tale, what happens. So the idea is, how can we get past this? Resolution of this conflict, boys start to identify with their fathers rather than seeing them as a rival. So as we can see in this photograph here, the little boy has his own little bitty more grass mower and is copying his father. So by trying to emulate his father, by trying to be like his father as a role model, he can successfully move on from this rival stage. Now, I don't go over this usually, but there's also a female version of this called the Electra complex, where the daughter wants to possess the father and sees the mother as a rival for the father. And this is based on the daughter having penis envy, and that's where that term comes from. So the idea is that we see Freud develop his theories of how we develop from utilizing his patients who had some psychological issues. We could see some problems from that from the get-go. All right, before I move on, are there any comments about any of this type of stuff? I want to make sure we understand what the theory was saying. If not, you can ask for clarification. You're going to do it through chat or through audio. Anyone want any clarification, or we got it?
I did have a quick question. I know they say you don't usually talk about the Electra
Okay.
complex, but is the penis envy, is that because the female wants to hold the position and the power that is traditionally given to a man's seating in society, or
go ahead.
or is it the actual like physical attraction, like I want like to mate?
My understanding has been it's about the power, source of power. So that would be the implication, is even at a young age, kids, they are usually more perceptive than sometimes we give them credit for, can see a differentiation in power. Does that make sense?
It does.
Okay, and so therefore, some others we'll see later, the neo-Freudians, particularly Karen Horney, totally disagrees with this. But the idea is that that is where Freud believed the little girls want to possess their fathers is all really about the power to some extent from that perspective. Sure. They don't have it, and that represents it. Okay. Now, one of the things too, yeah, no problem. One of the things too, we need to understand, just going back to common terms that we hear all the time that may tend to support some of these ideas that Freud came up with, and he articulated them in a way from a perspective of a thoughtful, philosophical psychologist and psychiatrist. But think about this: you've heard of Mama's Boys, correct? Okay,
Yes.
where we have the male putting the mother on an extraordinarily high pedestal. Mother can do nothing wrong. Even we see the most hardened criminals can do the same thing. Mother can do nothing wrong. I idolize it, I worship my mother. So that in a way sort of goes to that. And then we have the other thing too. Little girls can wrap, even teenage girls, wrap their dad around their little pinky, control them in a way. So you've heard of that before as well, correct?
Yes.
Okay, so the idea is that we do see that even in our non-common language and understanding of things, we do see that there seem to be sort of special relationships that have been carved out for mothers and their sons and daughters and their fathers, without the sexual part, but we do say there's something there that we seem to see generation after generation. But he did take it to a point where people did feel uncomfortable. We'll see a little bit more about that as we go. Okay, thanks for the question. So, Freud, how do we deal with anxiety? So we have all this stuff about the psychosexual stages of development that we go through, and all the stuff that comes along with that, particularly when we go to the phallic stage. But there's other things too that Freud came up with. And one of the reasons why he's still a very powerful figure, 100 years after, he was active, is because he came up with some things that still ring true to a lot of us. So here it comes down to, how do we deal with anxiety? Freud believed that we are anxious about our unacceptable wishes and impulses, and we repress this anxiety with the help of several strategies that we have listed here. So when something is not feeling right about us, or we feel guilty and have anxiety because of it, in order for us to feel better about it, we figure out a way to use one of a variety of what we refer to as defense mechanisms. Okay, and these defense mechanisms make it so that we can survive the anxiety that may result. Let's go through a couple for an example. All right, let's see which ones we may know. Okay, let's go through denial. Refusing to believe or even perceive a painful reality. Refusing to believe or even perceive a painful reality. That's denial. So let me paint you a picture here. Let's say it's years in the future. You have your degree, your colleagues have your degree when they were friends, and you visit their houses occasionally. And so let's say it's two females. One female is visiting the house of a close friend of theirs, and she's doing laundry. It sounds really sexist, but she's doing laundry and she's washing clothes. And your friend does not wear an ounce of makeup and never lipstick. And then you see her picking up her husband's shirt. And you notice, as she should notice, as she's putting treatment on his collar, that there is red lipstick on the collar. Now, for many of us, that would indicate there may be some issue going on there when it comes to fidelity. But you sit there noticing that your friend puts the stuff on it, scrubs it out, and puts it into the laundry, the washing machine, without much ado. So that could be denial. She does this stuff remotely, but does not make the connection that I don't wear lipstick. There's lipstick on my husband's collar here. That may mean that someone was close enough for him to get lipstick on his collar. That is denial. So the idea here is that if that friend let that come into her reality, then she would have to face that hard truth that her husband may be cheating on her or having an affair. So as opposed to not to have to deal with that anxious issue, she totally denies it by refusing to even note that it's really truly there or tied together as to what it means. Then we have displacement, the one just above it. Shifting sexual or aggressive impulses toward a more acceptable or less threatening object or person. So displacement, the example, a little girl kicks the family dog after her mother sends her to a room. So the little girl may have wanted to kick who, but thought that's not probably a bad idea. Someone tell me who she wanted to kick?
She wanted to kick her mom.
There you go. She wanted to kick her mom, but she was brilliant enough to realize that would have been a bad move. Therefore, she displaces that aggressive impulse toward a more acceptable or less threatening object or person. Now, depending on the type of dog you take, that might be just as bad. But the idea is we displace it onto something that is much more befitting of us, that does not put us in danger and increase our anxiety. So each one of these defense mechanisms are doing just that. They are trying to release anxiety in some way so you don't have to deal with it. For example, which is a good one? Oh, one that we use all the time, and don't say you haven't. You probably used it sometime this week. All right, rationalization. Offering self-justifying explanations in place of a real, more threatening, unconscious reason for one's action. Okay. Now I'll give you another example in a second here, but here one is like a habitual drinker says she drinks with her friends just to be sociable. So that's what she tells herself. I'm not an alcoholic. I'm just being very social. That's why I'm drinking. But here about this is another rationalization. Let's say you're walking in a neighborhood. It's one of those neighborhoods that have like little convenience stores from place to place. And as you turn the corner and walking down this sidewalk, you see there's an envelope on the ground. You bend over, you pick up the envelope, and there's a bunch of money in it, like a couple of $1,000s or so. What do you do? Well, we know what your id would want you to do is that's keep the money, the little devil. But your angel, your super ego would say, we need to find out whose money this is. You look in there, and there's nothing in there that indicates who possesses the money. But let's say you decide, you listen to the little id, you listen to the little devil in you, you fold the money up and you put it in your pocket and you keep walking. And let's say it's like $5,000 or so. At one point, you may start to come up with rationalizations. Well, what kind of money was that? Maybe that was bad money. Maybe that was money from somebody who was selling drugs in my neighborhood. And if they have this money, all they would do is cause more harm to my neighbor. In fact, it's probably a good idea that I have this money. You know, not only that this money is not in their little evil miscreant hands, but now I have this money that now allows me to go to Walmart and buy that nice little television I was looking at. Anybody know what I was doing? I was rationalizing there. Has anybody ever did anything remotely resembling rationalization of any behavior they did? They give a reason, a good reason why they did a certain behavior, as opposed to the bad reason that may be close to the truth. We don't know. We don't know, but it may be. So the idea is that whatever we go through, whatever anxiety pops up in our life, for whatever reason, Freud came up with this idea that we can defend against these anxieties in these ways. And I mean, it's a masterful stroke in a way that he came up with this, because it really does say a lot about people, because we all can relate to this. Okay, relate to it. Even the one of projection here, disguising one's own threatening impulses by attributing them to others. So a thief always sees other people as thieves. They project, because now I'm just one of many. I'm not a thief in the muck like myself. I'm a thief with all you rest of you thieves. We're all in the muck together. All right. So that's what we mean by defending against anxiety and some of those defense mechanisms. I think we have a couple of deep dives with a couple of more. Now, here is another example. The answers are already there for you guys, I believe. A politician gives anti-gay speeches, then turns out to have homosexual tendencies. Maybe it's one of those types of individuals get caught in a hotel room scam or something of that nature. That would be reaction formation. Now, reaction formation, just to go back real quickly, to look here, switching unacceptable impulses into their opposites. Repressing angry feelings, a person displays exaggerated friendliness. So this is when you can't stand your mother-in-law, which is not the case for me. I love her to death. When you act particularly ultra friendly to the person, you're doing the exact opposite of what your impulses may tell you to do. So here we have the politician who may have homosexual tendencies. He is talking about all anti-gay stuff all the time, anti-gay legislation all the time, because he is uncomfortable about those tendencies and he's having a reaction formation. Someone with an anger problem accuses everyone else of being angry and threatening. That is, again, going to be projection straight up. So what we see with these defense mechanisms is that they provide two things. These two are sometimes confused, reaction, formation, projection, by the way. The common theme, as with all defense mechanisms, is they seek to prevent being conscious of unacceptable feelings. So that's what they all try to cloud the true behavior that make you uncomfortable. Okay, the difference between these two is that the first one compensates. Okay, by reaction formation, you're going the exact opposite, trying to compensate for your homosexual tendencies by being very anti-gay. The more anti-gay, the better. And then the other one, the projection one, is one that simply tries to distract. So you are the one who may have this anger issues, but you just put it on someone else. It's just a simple distraction. It's not really changing your level at all by comparison. It's just putting it on other people so they can serve sort of as a distraction. All right. So that is what defense mechanisms are. And it's one of the things that has kept Freud sort of like in our mindset for many, many years, is because he's the one that sort of came up with the idea of what these defense mechanisms do for us and how we deal with anxiety. Now, Freudians after Freud. So we have all these ideas that Freud proposed. We have the notion of the unconscious and how powerful it is. He came up with techniques and ideas to dig deep into that iceberg, so to speak, to get underneath the waterline and uncover those unconscious things by using free association. He even used hypnosis for a time. He also used dream analysis. He also came with dream analysis. That's another reason why we talk about him so much, to analyze one's dreams, to try to get at what really is going on in someone's unconscious. But even after doing that and started this whole movement, the Freudian movement, not all the Freudians agreed with him. So the neo-Freudian and psychodynamic theorists, they had some different approaches. Psychodynamic theorists such as Adler and Horney and Jung accepted Freud's ideas about the following: the importance of the unconscious and childhood relationships in shaping your personality. So yeah, sure, that makes sense. The id, ego, and superego structure of the personality, and the role of defense mechanisms in reducing anxiety about uncomfortable ideas. But the theorists differed from Freud in a few ways as well. Adler and Horney believe that anxiety and personality are a function of social, not sexual tensions in childhood. So they moved away from the sexual focus to a more social focus, that this is the type of tension that really matters in childhood, not the sexual ones. Jung also believed that we have a collective unconscious containing images from our species experiences, not just personal repressed memories and wishes. Some of this collective unconscious, if you've heard of that before, I like to think of it oftentimes as us being humans, that we tend to have human issues that we deal with. And so these things are going to be somewhat common from one group or culture to another and from one person to another. But Jung believed that we have this collective unconscious containing all these experiences from our species past. Now, these individuals represent the psychodynamic theorists. Carl Jung, who highlighted universal themes and the unconscious as a source of creativity and insight, found opportunities for personal growth by finding meaning in moments of coincidence. Alfred Adler, who focused on the fight against feelings of inferiority. So he was the one who came up with the inferiority complex as a theme at the core of personality, although he may have been projecting here as well. And then Karen Horney, she criticized the Freudian portrayal of women as weak and subordinate to men. So obviously she would not like and did not like that whole idea of penis envy that Freud proposed that little girls have, because that's where the power is. She highlighted the need to feel secure in relationships as being one of the driving forces behind her views. So this just demonstrates to us that Freud was a major figure, started a whole school of thought, as well as perspective on how to view humans and our thoughts and how it is that we develop our personalities. And even though some disagreed, he still is a very credible figure in personality as well as the psychodynamic theorist movements. And so let's look again real quickly here at how do we do measuring of personality utilizing Freud's perspective. So assessing the unconscious. So how do we do this psychodynamic personality assessment? Well, Freud tried to get to unconscious themes to be projected into the conscious mind through free association and dream analysis. And that's what ultimately he was trying to do. He was trying to use a variety of techniques to uncover the things that we cover up in our unconscious because they're unacceptable in some way. And by bringing them out and showing them to the light of day, he is showing them to your conscious so that you can become aware of them. So he's showing these things, getting these things to be projected onto your conscious so that you have awareness. And the idea is that once you have that, then you can start to feel better. These things are no longer a mystery to you. So these projective tests, okay, projective tests are a structured, systematic exposure to a standardized set of ambiguous prompts designed to reveal inner dynamics. So they are systematically exposed to you, but the item that is being exposed to you are very ambiguous. And what you would do is you would expose them to a series of these ambiguous images, for example, and you would simply ask them, what do you see? So this is a Rorschach test. What do you see in these ink blots? Okay, some people would say, I see a rabbit, I see a deer, I see a man, whatever the case may be. And whatever they are seeing is primarily coming from the patient, because this can be seen as anything, this ink blot. And so when you are saying what you are seeing, you are projecting whatever's inside you onto that image. Now, the problem with the Rorschach test and most of the tests like this projective test here is that the results don't link well to traits. Whatever traits we have about personality, they don't seem to tie together. So we have low validity. They don't seem to be measuring what we think they're measuring. And different raters get different results. So if I get two of you to look at this ink blot and I ask one of you to tell me what it is that you see, you would say what you see. And then another person would say what they see. And normally they would not correlate with each other. So they would have low reliability. So something with low validity and low reliability should not be trusted that well. Now, in later classes, if you could keep taking psychology classes, you may see something called the thematic appreciation test, or TAT. And what they do, they don't show some ambiguous photograph, ambiguous image like this. They'll show you an ambiguous photograph. For example, you can see a man in a suit holding the hand of a little kid walking down the sidewalk in a big city. And so they'll show you that photograph, and then they'll tell you to write a story about that photograph. And then they'll analyze the story that you wrote for certain types of key things to give you some indication of what you are projecting onto that somewhat ambiguous scene. And that way they'll be able to get at some ideas of what's going on with you. For example, you may give the father a high need for achievement by saying he's taking some busy time off his day at work or at lunchtime to walk with his kid on summer break so that he can spend some time with him. Now, you are the one who brought up the idea of need for achievement, or he's a busy executive. Therefore, you may have that need in you about need for achievement or spending time with your dad. So that's the way that would work. So there are other projective type tests out there. Rorschach test is just one type of them. There are other types too that are involving slightly different types of projective type of thing and stimuli that they want you to say, what is this? Okay. All right. Any questions before we move on to Freud's legacy? All right, cool. All right. So now let's talk about Freud's legacy. Well, wasn't perfect. There are lots of flaws in Freud's scientific method. In fact, some would say he really did not follow a scientific method. First, there was unfalsifiability. He developed theories that are hard to prove or disprove. So if something is hard to prove or disprove, then we have ourselves an issue when it comes to science. Science needs to be able to prove something one way or another, or at least find evidence that can either be in support of or support against something that we are trying to explore scientifically. So can we test to see if there is an id? In what way could we test to see if there's an id? So unfalsifiability is one of the issues. The other is unrepresentative sampling. He did not build his theories on a broad sample of observations. He described all of humanity based on people with unusual psychological problems. That's one of the biggies. So unlike the humanists that we'll see shortly, the Freudian and Freud's theory is based on people with some serious issues. Biased observations. He based theories on his patients, which may give him an incentive to see them as unwell before his treatment. And post facto explanations or hindsight bias. Rather than predictions, he was making a lot of postdictions. Whether or not a situation makes you anxious or not, you can either be fixated or repressing. Okay, so he would look at a case that was presented to him and then explain what happened, what made this person the way that he is. That's not prediction, that's postdiction. If he wanted to truly predict something, he would have to find somebody who's really young and make specific predictions of how they would turn out in the future, and then see if that was actually true. But that's not what his research was based on. His research was based on things which were, for the most part, unfalsifiable, based on an underrepresentative sample, and post facto explanations. He would explain something after it happened. He would not predict something before it happened. That would be a stronger case. So there are several flaws that Freud had. Now, in the meantime, evidence has updated Freud's ideas. First, one of the things that I need to emphasize here, I don't know if I did it in the previous lecture, is that Freud believed that your personality was basically established by the time you're 7 years old or so. So by the time you get out of your phallic stage of development, your personality is what it is. That's the way he saw it. Okay. So after that time frame, you were basically done as a personality. So what the evidence does say here now is that development appears to be lifelong, not set in stone by childhood. So the research that we have seen and what we've done in most of this course so far, we've seen that we develop, again, across a lifespan. We've seen that time and time again. So the idea that Freud had does not seem to bear too much weight. Infant neural networks are not mature enough to create lifelong impact of childhood trauma. So especially if you're talking about before 3, it's very unlikely that you are going to have memories of anything, at least episodic memories, that may have some long-lasting impact on the individual as they grow. Peers have more influence on personality and parents less than Freud assumed. Dreams, as well as slips of the tongue, have many possible origins, less likely to reveal deep unconscious conflicts and wishes. We may ignore threatening information, but traumatic memories are usually intensely remembered, not repressed. And see, one of the key things that his theory is based on is that of repression. And of course, we have this notion that we've talked about several times before already, about repressed memories. And the idea if something traumatic happens, usually they will intensely be remembered, not repressed. And so that's one thing too that I want to remind ourselves of. Still, sexual abuse stories are more likely to be fact and less likely to be wish fulfillment than Freud thought previously. So it could have been that some of the instances where his patients talked about having sexual encounters with adults, it might have been more likely to be cases of sexual abuse that he was uncovering as opposed to something else like wish fulfillment. Gender and sexual identity seem to be more a function of genetics than Oedipus conflicts in relationships with parents. And we talked about orientation earlier. This seems to be suggesting what that is talking about here, that the research that we have in front of us so far suggests that such things as sexual identity, gender identity, sexual orientation may be more biological than anything cultural or dealing with how and what conditions you were raised in. And then we have the unconscious. The unconscious is seen today. So remember we stated previously that the unconscious is seen as a reservoir. Here, the unconscious is not going to be seen as a reservoir. The following processes operate at an unconscious level, not because they're repressed, but because they're automatic. And again, we've talked about many of these previously about these automatic processes. And it's these automatic processes normally that are being processed automatically that we have no conscious awareness of. And that's why we don't have awareness of them. Not that they're being repressed, they're just automatically done. We have schemas guide our perceptions. The right hemisphere makes choices that the left hemisphere doesn't verbalize. We have conditioned responses, learned skills, and procedures all guide our actions without conscious recall. That's why that person who taught you that golf swing tells you to stop thinking about it. Just do it. Because once you start to try to use it with conscious recall, it messes it up. Because these things are not conscious. These things are now part of the automatic processing that was done. And then emotions can get activated. Stereotypes influence our reactions, and priming affects our choices. So all this stuff that we have talked about previously sort of points to things that can be automatically processed. Okay. And therefore, because it's automatically processed, we don't have awareness of it. So when we talk about the unconscious is a stream, not a reservoir. It's a process, not necessarily a place or a location. And because of this stream or these processes, these things that happen automatically, we're just not aware of them because that's the way our brain is sort of structured. Automatic stuff that happens automatically, we may not have conscious awareness of. And finally, when it comes to Freud's legacy, Freud benefited psychology, giving us ideas about the impact of childhood on adulthood, human irrationality, sexuality, evil, defenses, anxiety, and so on, between our biological selves and our socialized, civilized selves. Freud gave us specific concepts we often use today, such as ego, projection, regression, complex, oral fixation, all these types of things, sibling rivalry and Freudian slips. All these things came from one individual's mind who really was able to popularize it and become sort of like a rock star of his era in this era that promoted psychology to a large extent. So not bad for someone writing over 100 years ago with no technology for seeing inside the brain at all. But some people had some major issues with Freud's work, and that's what we'll touch on now. And that starts off with the humanist reaction to Freudian and behaviorist views. So who we're going to be talking about, Maslow becoming self-actualized person, Rogers growing in a social environment of genuineness and acceptance and empathy, assessing the self, evaluating humanistic theories, what about evil, and do we have too much individualism? So here are some of the topics that we'll cover as we wrap things up here today. So let's talk about these individuals. We have Abraham Maslow and Carl Rogers. Now, in the 1960s, some psychologists, namely these two, began to reject the dehumanizing ideas and behaviorism. Remember, the dehumanizing ideas and behaviorism would be this: if we can control the consequences of behavior, we can control the person. That's behavior modification 101. That's B.F. Skinner. And so the idea is when they kept saying things like that, it started to infuriate the humanists. The other one is the dysfunctional view of people from the psychodynamic thought that Freud proposes. So both of these were issues according to the humanists, and so they wanted to take a different approach. Maslow and Rogers sought to offer a third force in psychology, this humanistic perspective. They studied, listen to this, they studied healthy people rather than people with mental health problems. Humanism, focusing on the conditions that support healthy personal growth. And so this is very much contrary to what we saw Freud do. Freud was looking at people who had some major issues, whereas the humanists were looking at people who were successful, who were deemed to be healthy. So again, we're not going to go too much into this, but I want to remind you of Abraham Maslow's the self-actualizing person. Maslow's view of people are motivated to keep moving up a hierarchy of needs, going beyond getting basic needs met. So again, remember his hierarchy of needs. The lower base needs are like physiological needs, safety needs, and once the safety needs are met, we go to belonging needs and all that type of stuff. Ultimately, at the very top of this hierarchy are self-actualization, where a person is fulfilling one's potential. And there are even some pyramids that we've seen that even go beyond that. They'll have self-transcendence, meaning that you have gone beyond self-focus. You are now self-transcendence. And so you no longer talk about the needs of the self at all. You just are beyond that. And so this is what he proposes. And so Maslow says the ideal state, a personality includes being self-aware, self-accepted, open, ethical, spontaneous, loving, caring, focusing on the greater mission than social acceptance. So he puts into our basket, so to speak, a lot of very positive, ideal things that we should become and that we should be able to accomplish. And that is what he was driving us for by offering this vision in the humanistic movement of psychology back in the 60s. Then we have Rogers' person-centered perspective. Rogers agreed that people have this natural tendency to grow, become healthy, and move toward self-actualization. The three conditions that facilitate growth, okay, very much like water, nutrients, and light for a plant, he saw it as genuineness, being honest, direct, and not using a facade like a fake face. Acceptance, also known as unconditional positive regard, acknowledging feelings without passing judgment. Empathy, tuning into the feelings of others, showing your efforts to understand and listen well. So also want to focus here that empathy is not sympathy. What is important to nurture growth is to have someone understand you, consider your feelings, and hold them for you. This is more vital growth than just having somebody feel sorry for you. So empathy is much more than sympathy. It's not the same thing. So what he was basically saying, in his approach to therapy even, you have to be genuine, accepting, and show empathy. And this would get the most positive natural tendencies of healthy growth by doing this. Now, again, let me just focus real quickly on this unconditional positive regard. You can hate what someone does, okay? But you don't pass judgment on them. So the behavior of someone can be bad and atrocious, and you can disregard that behavior, but you don't pass judgment on them for doing that behavior. Okay. Now, let me give you another example of unconditional positive regard. For example, you have someone who goes to college and their tuition is being paid for by their parents, and they're in accounting, and they discover they can't stand accounting. So they leave accounting and switch programs, and the parents find out about it. And let's say if the parents are okay, let's say no parents are okay with it, but one set of parents said, don't come home for Christmas. Since you changed programs, I don't want to see you for Christmas. But the other one says, come on home for Christmas. We love to see you. One of the parents' units here has conditional positive regard. We love you and we'll treat you nice only if you do what we tell you to. Those are the conditions. Or even though you may have disappointed us and we don't like what you have done here, we still love you. We want to see you for Christmas. So that's the idea of conditional versus unconditional positive regard. That idea of acceptance, but not passing judgment. Okay. All right. So what we have then is one other idea that we look at when it comes to humanistic movements and humanistic psychology is the ideal versus the actual self. In the humanistic perspective, the core of personality is the self concept, our sense of our nature and our identity. People are the happiest with a self concept that matches their ideal self. So when your concept and your ideal self overlap greatly, that's joy, 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 happy, 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 because you are sort of like attuned with yourself. Thus, it is important to ask people to describe themselves as they are and as they ideally would like to be. So questionnaires can be used, but some prefer an open interview. Questions about the actual self. How do you see yourself? What do you like? What do you do? What do you value? What are you capable of? If the answers do not match the ideal self, self-acceptance may be needed, not just self-change. So the idea here is that we're going to see how this can have an impact on many of us. For example, part of the self-concept will be our self-image, how we see ourselves. Today, and I'm going to focus on one population because they are usually going to be more focused by than most other populations, young adolescent females who are driven to look certain ways based on what television shows them, what movies show them, what magazines show them. And oftentimes these magazine models, they'll be the first to tell you that that's not them on the cover. All their blemishes have been covered over. Their faces have been fixed a little bit to make it more symmetrical. They've been airbrushed here or there. But the idea is that when we have the self-image and your ideal self-image don't match, people have issues. So it's the same basic idea there that can be somewhat problematic. Now, critiquing the humanistic perspective, what about evil? People say the humanists lose a lot because some say Rogers did not appreciate the human capacity for evil. Rogers saw evil this way, though. Rogers saw evil as a social phenomenon, not an individual trait. His quote goes something like this: when I look at the world, I'm pessimistic, but when I look at people, I am optimistic. Think about what we recently just saw in the previous lectures on social psychology about evil, about obedience, okay, about people harming other people because legitimate authority told them to. So here, this almost is aligned exactly with that. When I look at the world, I am pessimistic, but when I look at people, I am optimistic. Carl Rogers. So the idea here is that that is their perspective on things. Yeah, they know evil is there, but they see evil as a social phenomenon. So the humanist response, self-acceptance is not the end. It then allows us to move on from defending our own needs to loving and caring for others. And finally, we look at critiquing the human perspective. Is it too much self-centeredness? Some say that the pursuit of self-concept and accepting the ideal self and self-actualization encourage not self-transcendence, but self-indulgence and self-centeredness. Okay, that's what that's basically communicating. But humanist response is the therapist using this approach, using this humanistic perspective. Now, remember, this is also a therapeutic approach. The client-centered therapy is a way to help people to grow and to achieve. So what they're saying here is the humanist response, the therapist using this approach should not encourage selfishness and should keep in mind that positive regard means acceptance, not praise. So acceptance, but not praise of behavior. So that in a nutshell takes us through the work we want to see with personality, looking at Freud, and then looking at the humanistic perspective. That's all I wanted to cover for today. And that's it. Are there any questions or comments so far? Okay, if there are no questions or comments, let's see if there's something I wanted to tell you. I'll be starting to look at your current event papers very soon. Also, I'll be making an adjustment to the final due date. I think it was TBD in your books, I mean in your syllabus, but I'll probably be moving it to the May 4th. I'll give you some more information about that a little bit later. All right, that's it for today. I have nothing else to share with you guys. You guys have a nice rest of the week. I'll see you on Thursday. Talk to you guys later. Bye-bye.